The sound of combat boots thundered across the concrete as 5 Marines cornered the young woman against the chain-link fence behind the commissary. "Listen here, Princess," Corporal Jake Morrison sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Your mommy can't protect you on base forever. Time you learned some respect." The 19-year-old brunette, Sarah Kane, stood perfectly still, her green eyes calm despite being outnumbered 5-1. What these Marines didn't know was that her mother, Captain Sarah Kane, was watching from 200 yards away through binoculars. What they really didn't know was that Captain Kane wasn't just any officer. She was the woman who had trained half the Navy SEALs on this base in advanced combat techniques. As the Marines closed in on her daughter, Sarah dropped the binoculars, and for the first time in 3 years, the legendary Ghost Wolf Instructor was about to remind everyone why she earned that name. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Meet Captain Sarah Kane, 42 years old, average height with weathered hands and sharp amber eyes that seemed to catalog every detail around her. She had been stationed at Camp Pendleton Marine Base in Southern California for 18 months, working as a logistics coordinator in the supply division. To most personnel on base, she was just another desk officer who processed equipment requisitions and managed inventory databases. The base was predominantly male, filled with young Marines fresh from boot camp and seasoned veterans who had little patience for what they perceived as paper pushers. Sarah kept to herself, arriving early each morning to organize supply shipments, coordinate equipment maintenance schedules, and ensure that training units had everything they needed. She never participated in the informal gatherings at the enlisted club, never joined the weekend barbecues, and rarely spoke about her previous assignments. The younger Marines called her Supply Sarah behind her back, always polite to her face but dismissive when they thought she couldn't hear. Her daughter Riley had been living on base for the past 6 months, taking online college courses while working part-time at the base library. Riley was quiet like her mother, preferring books to parties, but she had inherited something else from Sarah that wasn't immediately obvious, an unwavering inner strength that showed itself as calm confidence rather than aggression. The mother and daughter lived in modest on-base housing, keeping a low profile and drawing little attention to themselves. The problems had started 3 weeks ago when Riley inadvertently witnessed something she shouldn't have. Corporal Morrison and his crew had been selling military equipment to unauthorized buyers off base, night vision goggles, tactical gear, even ammunition. It was a lucrative side business that had been running for months without detection. Riley had been returning late from the library when she saw them loading gear into a civilian truck behind the maintenance warehouse. Morrison had spotted her before she could slip away. "You didn't see anything, college girl," he had warned her, stepping close enough that she could smell alcohol on his breath. "And if you think about running to daddy or mommy, remember that accidents happen on military bases all the time." Since that night, Morrison and his friends had been escalating their harassment. They would accidentally bump into Riley at the commissary, make crude comments when she walked past their group, and find excuses to show up wherever she was studying or working. They were careful to avoid doing anything too obvious when other personnel were around, but their message was clear: keep quiet or face consequences. Sarah had noticed the change in her daughter's behavior immediately. Riley had become more withdrawn, choosing to eat meals in their housing unit instead of at the dining facility, and she had started requesting different shifts at the library to avoid certain hours. When Sarah pressed her for answers, Riley had deflected, claiming she was just focused on her studies and didn't want social distractions. But Sarah Kane hadn't survived 15 years in special operations by missing subtle signs of trouble. She began watching more carefully, noting the tension in Riley's shoulders when certain groups of Marines walked by, the way her daughter would suddenly change direction when she spotted familiar faces, and how Riley had started carrying pepper spray, something she had never needed before. 3 days ago, Sarah had seen Corporal Morrison approach Riley outside the base post office. The conversation had appeared casual from a distance, but Sarah could read body language like others read newspapers. Morrison's posture was aggressive, territorial. Riley's response had been controlled but guarded. When Riley walked away, Morrison had smiled, not a friendly expression, but the kind of predatory grin that Sarah had seen on the faces of dangerous men in combat zones around the world. That evening, Sarah had tried again to get Riley to open up about what was happening. They sat on the small couch in their living room, Sarah's instincts telling her that her daughter was in some kind of danger, but Riley insisted everything was fine. "Mom, you worry too much," Riley had said, forcing a smile. "It's just typical military base drama, nothing I can't handle." But Sarah knew her daughter was protecting her from something, just as Sarah had been protecting Riley from the truth about her own background for the past 3 years. Riley believed her mother was simply a logistics officer who had transferred from a desk job at another base. She had no idea that Sarah Kane had spent the previous 12 years as one of the Navy's most elite special operations instructors, training SEAL teams in advanced combat techniques, psychological warfare, and crisis response. Riley didn't know that her mother had earned the nickname Ghost Wolf for her ability to appear and disappear during training exercises, teaching some of the military's most elite warriors how to survive in impossible situations. She didn't know that Sarah had personally trained over 200 Navy SEALs, many of whom now held leadership positions throughout the special operations community. Most importantly, Riley had no idea that her mother had requested the transfer to this logistics position specifically to give them both a quieter life after years of high-stress deployments and training assignments. Sarah had wanted Riley to have a normal college experience, free from the intensity that had defined Sarah's career. Now, as Sarah watched through her office window and saw Morrison's group positioning themselves near the commissary exit, clearly waiting for Riley to finish her shift at the library, she realized that her attempt at a normal life was about to collide with the reality that some situations require more than normal solutions. Have you ever tried to start over in a new place, hoping to leave your past behind, only to discover that sometimes your past is exactly what's needed to protect the people you love? Drop a shield emoji in the comments if you've ever had to choose between hiding who you are and defending what matters most. The dismissive treatment had started on Sarah's very first day at Camp Pendleton, as she reported to the Supply Division office, carrying her transfer orders and a standard-issue duffel bag. Gunnery Sergeant Rick Bull Torino looked her up and down with undisguised skepticism. "Another desk jockey," he muttered to his assistant, loud enough for Sarah to hear. "Probably couldn't handle field duty, so they shuffled her into logistics." Bull Torino was old-school Marine Corps, 30 years of service, multiple combat deployments, and the kind of presence that made junior enlisted Marines snap to attention from 50 yards away. He had requested a combat veteran for the logistics coordinator position, someone who understood the urgency of battlefield supply chains. Instead, he got what appeared to be a mid-career officer looking for an easy assignment before retirement. "Kane, right?" Bull said, not bothering to stand from his desk chair. "Let me guess. Previous assignment was some air-conditioned office in Virginia, processing paperwork for colonels who never left the Pentagon." His tone carried the particular contempt that career Marines reserved for what they perceived as soft military personnel. Sarah simply nodded and placed her orders on his desk. "Reporting for duty, Gunnery Sergeant. Ready to begin whenever you'd like to brief me on current operations." Her response was professional, calm, and completely without defensiveness, which somehow made Bull even more irritated. He had expected pushback, excuses, or at least some sign that his words had stung. Instead, this woman acted like his opinion didn't matter at all. "Current operations," Bull repeated, with a harsh laugh. "Listen, lady, this isn't some corporate supply chain. We keep Marines alive by getting them what they need, when they need it, under impossible conditions. Think you can handle that pressure?" "I'll do my best, Gunnery Sergeant," Sarah replied evenly. From that first interaction, the tone was set. Bull assigned Sarah to the most tedious tasks: cataloging inventory in the warehouse, processing routine supply requests, and handling equipment returns from training exercises. He made sure she understood that she was starting at the bottom of the hierarchy, regardless of her captain's rank. The other Marines in the supply division quickly picked up on Bull's attitude and adjusted their behavior accordingly. Staff Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez, who managed equipment distribution, began explaining basic military supply procedures to Sarah, as if she were a fresh recruit rather than an experienced officer. "See, Captain," he would say with exaggerated patience, "in the field, Marines don't have the luxury of waiting for proper paperwork. Sometimes you have to improvise." Corporal Jennifer Walsh, the only other woman in the division, initially tried to be supportive. "Don't take it personally," she told Sarah during their second week. "Bull's always harder on transfers, especially officers who haven't been in combat roles. He'll warm up once you prove yourself." But Sarah never seemed to try to prove herself in the traditional sense. She didn't share war stories, didn't mention previous assignments, and never pushed back when given menial tasks. This only reinforced the growing perception that she was exactly what Bull had assumed: a career bureaucrat who had managed to avoid real military challenges. The dismissive attitude extended beyond her immediate division. During weekly base briefings, other department heads would politely acknowledge Sarah's presence, but rarely sought her input on operational matters. Colonel James Hartwell, the base commander, treated her with the kind of distant courtesy reserved for necessary but unremarkable personnel. "Captain Kane handles our supply coordination," he would say, when introducing her to visiting officers, with a tone that clearly indicated this was not a position requiring exceptional skill or experience. "Keeps our paperwork in order." The younger Marines were even less subtle in their dismissal. They had developed a habit of explaining basic military concepts to her, assuming she lacked field experience. During equipment inspections, Lance Corporal Tommy Bradley would point out obvious features of weapons and gear, speaking slowly as if addressing someone unfamiliar with military hardware. "This is an M4 carbine, Captain," he said during one inspection, holding up a rifle that any military officer should instantly recognize. "Standard infantry weapon, pretty different from what you'd see in an office environment." Sarah would nod politely and continue her inspection checklist, never correcting his assumptions or pointing out that she was probably more familiar with that particular weapon than he would ever be. The most frustrating part for some of the more observant personnel was Sarah's complete lack of reaction to their condescension. She never appeared offended, never argued for more challenging assignments, and never tried to assert her authority as a captain. This passive acceptance only seemed to confirm their belief that she belonged exactly where she was. Even during monthly fitness evaluations, Sarah performed adequately, but not exceptionally. She passed all required tests with solid scores that met standards without standing out. Bull used these results as further evidence of his initial assessment. "Typical desk officer," he told Rodriguez after reviewing her PT scores. "Good enough to check the boxes, not good enough to lead Marines in anything serious." What none of them noticed were the subtle signs that might have indicated Sarah's true background. They didn't pay attention to how she instinctively scanned rooms upon entering, cataloging exits and potential threats. They missed the way she carried herself with perfect balance, never off guard, even when appearing relaxed. Most importantly, they failed to notice how she observed everything, every conversation, every personality conflict, every operational detail, with the kind of systematic attention that comes from years of tactical training. Riley had experienced a different but equally dismissive reception when she started working at the base library. The Marines who frequented the facility treated her like a typical college student playing at military life, while her mother served out a comfortable assignment. They were polite but patronizing, often making comments about campus life and asking if she found the military environment too intense for someone used to civilian comforts. Morrison and his crew had initially been among those who viewed both Sarah and Riley as soft targets, people who didn't really belong in their world of combat readiness and warrior culture. Sarah was just another paper pusher who had somehow obtained officer rank without earning it. Riley was just another dependent taking up space and resources that should go to real military families. This perception had made Riley an appealing target when Morrison decided he needed leverage to ensure her silence about his illegal activities. In his mind, she was a weak civilian with a weak mother who processed supply orders and wouldn't know how to fight back against real Marines. The irony was that Morrison's dismissive attitude toward Sarah had prevented him from doing the kind of background research that might have warned him away from threatening her daughter. He saw only what he expected to see, a middle-aged logistics officer who posed no threat to his operations. As Sarah sat in her office watching Morrison's group gather near the commissary, she reflected on how thoroughly she had succeeded in hiding her true capabilities, perhaps too thoroughly. Her commitment to giving Riley a normal life had required her to accept a role that made her appear weak and unremarkable. But now, as she watched her daughter walking unknowingly toward a confrontation with 5 Marines who believed they could intimidate her without consequences, Sarah realized that maintaining her cover might be about to become impossible. Have you ever had to bite your tongue while others underestimated your abilities, knowing that proving them wrong might cost you something precious? Sometimes staying quiet takes more strength than speaking up. The first sign that Sarah Kane wasn't quite who she appeared to be came during what should have been a routine equipment inspection 3 months into her assignment. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had been conducting inventory on returned training gear when he discovered a serious problem. Several M4 carbines were showing signs of dangerous mechanical failure. The firing pins were worn beyond safe operational limits, creating a risk of misfires that could injure Marines during live fire exercises. Rodriguez brought the rifles to Sarah's desk with obvious frustration. "Captain, we've got a real problem here. These weapons came back from the 2nd Battalion's desert training exercise, and they're all showing the same wear pattern. I've never seen anything like this before. It's like they've been subjected to extreme conditions that shouldn't exist in a standard training environment." Sarah took one of the rifles and began examining it with what Rodriguez initially assumed was the careful attention of someone trying to look competent. She turned the weapon over in her hands, checking the exterior for obvious damage. But then something changed in her examination technique. Her movements became more precise, more knowing. She field-stripped the rifle with movements so fluid and automatic that Rodriguez found himself watching more carefully. This wasn't the hesitant disassembly of someone following a manual. This was muscle memory developed through thousands of repetitions. Within 30 seconds, she had the weapon completely broken down, examining each component with the kind of focused intensity that Rodriguez had only seen from master armorers. "The firing pin wear isn't from normal use," Sarah said quietly. holding up the small metal component to the light. Look at the impact pattern here. This is consistent with dry firing exercises performed in an environment with extremely fine sand particulates. The Marines were probably conducting advanced target acquisition drills in conditions where sand was getting into the action with every trigger pull. Rodriguez stared at her. Advanced target acquisition drills weren't part of standard infantry training. That kind of specialized exercise was typically reserved for reconnaissance units or special operations forces. More importantly, Sarah's analysis was far more detailed than anything he could have provided, despite his 8 years of experience with infantry weapons. "How do you know that, Captain?" he asked, genuinely curious now rather than condescending. Sarah paused for just a moment, as if realizing she had revealed more expertise than intended. "I've seen similar wear patterns in previous assignments," she said simply, but her tone had shifted slightly. There was a confidence in her voice that hadn't been there during her earlier explanations of basic supply procedures. She continued examining the other rifles, her hands moving with the same practiced efficiency. Within minutes, she had identified the exact cause of the mechanical failures and recommended a specific cleaning protocol that would restore the weapons to safe operating condition. Her recommendations were so precise that Rodriguez found himself taking detailed notes. "You'll want to use a specialized solvent, CLP Pro, not the standard issue cleaner, and pay particular attention to the bolt carrier group," Sarah explained. "The sand particles create a micro-abrasive effect that standard cleaning won't address. Each weapon will need approximately 45 minutes of detailed cleaning, and you'll need to replace the firing pins on rifles with serial numbers ending in 4, 7, and 9. Rodriguez looked down at his notes, then back at Sarah. Her assessment was incredibly specific, the kind of technical knowledge that typically came from advanced armorer training or extensive field experience with weapons maintenance under extreme conditions. Neither of those backgrounds fit with her official assignment history as a logistics coordinator. The next incident occurred 2 weeks later during a supply emergency. A training convoy had broken down in the desert 40 miles from base, leaving 30 Marines stranded in 110-degree heat. With limited water, the standard protocol would have been to dispatch a recovery team with appropriate vehicles and supplies, but the nearest available unit was 4 hours away. Bull Torino was pacing his office, frustrated by the logistics of the rescue operation. "We need to get water and medical supplies out there fast, but every recovery vehicle is already deployed. This is turning into a cluster that's going to end up in someone's personnel file." Sarah knocked on his doorframe. "Gunnery Sergeant, I might have a solution." Bull looked up with barely concealed irritation. "Unless you've got a helicopter hidden in the supply closet, Captain, I don't think—" "The training convoy is stranded near grid reference 237542, Sarah interrupted, consulting a topographical map she had brought with her. "If we approach from the northeast using the old mining access road, we can get within 2 miles of their position using standard supply trucks. From there, it's a straight-line march across relatively flat terrain." Bull frowned. "How do you know about mining access roads? That's not on any of our standard maps." Sarah spread her map on his desk, pointing to details that weren't visible on the base's standard issue charts. "This is a geological survey map from 2018. The mining road was decommissioned, but it's still passable for military vehicles. More importantly, it approaches the stranded convoy from high ground, which means better radio communication and easier visual identification of their exact position." Her finger traced a route that seemed to cut the rescue time in half. "If we load 2 trucks with water and medical supplies, plus a 6-man team equipped for rapid deployment, We can have personnel on site within 90 minutes instead of 4 hours. Bull stared at the map, then at Sarah. The route she had identified was tactically sound and demonstrated a level of operational planning that went far beyond logistics coordination. This was the kind of mission analysis typically performed by reconnaissance specialists or officers with extensive field command experience. "Where did you get this map, Captain?" he asked. "I requested it when I first arrived," Sarah replied. "I wanted to understand the operational environment around the base." That response raised even more questions. Why would a logistics officer need to understand terrain features that weren't relevant to standard supply operations? Why would she have access to geological survey data? And why did she speak about rapid deployment and tactical approaches with the casual confidence of someone who had planned similar operations before? The rescue mission proceeded exactly as Sarah had outlined. The Marines were successfully extracted with no casualties, and Bull's after-action report praised the innovative approach that had saved valuable time and resources. But privately, he began paying much closer attention to Captain Sarah Kane. The third incident that raised eyebrows occurred during a base security drill. A simulated terrorist attack scenario required all personnel to evacuate to designated safe zones while security forces responded to the threat. During these exercises, most personnel followed evacuation procedures exactly as trained, quickly but calmly moving to assigned positions and waiting for all clear signals. Sarah, however, displayed behaviors that caught the attention of Master Sergeant David Crawford, the base's senior security specialist. Instead of simply following the crowd to her assigned evacuation zone, Sarah moved with purpose and awareness that suggested advanced security training. Crawford watched as Sarah positioned herself near exits that provided multiple escape routes, maintained visual contact with potential threat approaches, and seemed to be conducting her own tactical assessment of the situation rather than simply following evacuation protocols. When a simulated secondary explosive device was announced in one of the evacuation zones, Sarah had already moved her group to an alternative position before the announcement was made. "Captain Kane," Crawford approached her after the drill concluded, "can I ask how you knew to move away from Building 7 before we announced the secondary threat?" Sarah looked at him calmly. The timing of the initial alarm and the location of the first simulated explosion suggested a classic diversionary tactic. Building 7 was the most obvious secondary target because it contained the largest concentration of evacuated personnel. Crawford's eyes narrowed. That kind of threat analysis wasn't taught in standard military training. It was the sort of tactical thinking developed through specialized security courses or real-world experience with terrorist tactics. "Have you had advanced security training, Captain?" "Some," Sarah replied, but offered no additional details. These incidents created a growing sense among the more observant base personnel that Captain Sarah Kane might not be exactly who she appeared to be. Her knowledge seemed too specific, her instincts too sharp, and her analytical abilities too advanced for someone with a standard logistics background. But Sarah continued to maintain her low profile, deflecting questions about her previous assignments and focusing on routine supply duties. She seemed content to let others underestimate her capabilities, even as those capabilities occasionally revealed themselves in moments of crisis or technical challenge. What none of them realized was that these glimpses of expertise were just the surface of much deeper and more dangerous skills that Sarah had spent 3 years carefully keeping hidden. Have you ever caught someone in a moment where their true expertise showed through their humble facade? Sometimes the most capable people are the ones who never feel the need to prove it. The nickname started innocently enough, born from Bull Torino's growing frustration with Sarah's unflappable demeanor during their daily operational briefings. Every morning at 0800 hours, the supply division would gather in the cramped conference room adjacent to the warehouse to review the day's priorities, address equipment issues, and coordinate with other base departments. During these meetings, Sarah would sit quietly at the far end of the table, taking detailed notes and responding to questions with precise, factual answers that somehow managed to reveal nothing about her thought processes or previous experience. When Bull would deliberately test her knowledge with complex scenarios or obscure regulations, she would provide accurate responses without any trace of pride or defensiveness. It was this complete absence of ego that began to irritate Bull more than incompetence would have. He was used to dealing with two types of officers: those who admitted their limitations and asked for guidance, and those who tried to prove their competence through displays of knowledge or authority. Sarah fit neither category. She simply existed in a space of quiet competence that seemed to make no demands on anyone's attention or respect. "You know what your problem is, Kane?" Bull announced during a particularly tense briefing about delayed equipment deliveries that were affecting training schedules across the base. "You act like you're above all this, like you're too good for the real work we do here." The room fell silent. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in his chair, while Corporal Walsh looked down at her paperwork to avoid witnessing what appeared to be the beginning of a confrontation between a gunnery sergeant and a captain. Sarah looked up from her notes, meeting Bull's gaze directly but without challenge. "I'm not above anything, gunnery sergeant. If there's something specific you'd like me to do differently, I'm listening." That response, calm, professional, and completely without defensiveness, only seemed to fuel Bull's irritation. "See, that's exactly what I'm talking about. You never get rattled, never show any real emotion, never prove that you actually care about what happens to these Marines. You're like some kind of robot programmed to give perfect answers." He leaned back in his chair, a sardonic smile spreading across his weathered face. "From now on, that's what we'll call you. Robot Kane, or better yet, Supply Bot." "Yeah, that fits. Supply Bot Kane, always ready with the right answer, but never showing us what's really going on upstairs." The nickname caught on immediately among the younger Marines in the division. By the end of the week, Supply Bot had become Sarah's unofficial designation throughout the entire logistics department. Lance Corporal Bradley was the first to use it directly to her face, approaching her desk with a requisition form that had been filled out incorrectly. "Hey, Supply Bot," he said with the casual confidence of someone who believed he was being clever rather than disrespectful. "Can you run this through your database and tell me what I messed up? Your circuits are better at catching errors than my human brain." Sarah took the form, reviewed it quickly, and handed it back with 3 specific corrections marked in red ink. "The item codes are transposed in Section 4. You're missing the authorization signature, and the delivery date conflicts with the training schedule. Fix those issues and resubmit." Bradley nodded and walked away, completely missing the fact that Sarah's database analysis had taken approximately 15 seconds and identified problems that should have required consulting multiple reference documents and cross-checking with other departments. The nickname spread beyond the supply division when Bull began using it during interdepartmental meetings. "We'll have Supply Bot run the numbers on that equipment request," he would announce when other department heads asked about delivery timelines or inventory availability. "She's got all the data programmed into her head." Colonel Hartwell initially seemed uncomfortable with the informal nickname being used in official settings, but Bull's tone was always technically respectful, and Sarah never objected or requested that it stop. Eventually, even the base commander began referring to her as Supply Bot Kane in casual conversation, treating it as an accepted part of her identity. The psychological impact of the nickname was exactly what Bull intended. It reduced Sarah from a commissioned officer with unknown capabilities to a predictable mechanical entity whose responses could be anticipated and whose authority could be safely ignored. When Marines throughout the base heard supply bot, they understood that this was someone who processed information efficiently but posed no threat to established hierarchies or social dynamics. Rodriguez initially felt uncomfortable with the derogatory labeling. During a private conversation with Bull, he suggested that constantly mocking a superior officer might eventually create problems. "She's still a captain, Gunny. What if she decides to file a complaint or assert her authority?" Bull laughed dismissively. "Supply bot doesn't have the backbone for confrontation. Look at her. She takes everything we throw at her and just keeps processing data like nothing happened. Besides, she knows she doesn't belong here. The nickname just reminds her of her place in the food chain." What Bull didn't realize was that his constant use of supply bot was having an entirely different effect than intended. Rather than diminishing Sarah's status, it was making her nearly invisible, which suited her purposes perfectly. When people began thinking of her as a predictable mechanical entity, they stopped paying attention to the subtle details that might have revealed her true background. The nickname became so pervasive that newer personnel arriving at the base assumed it was Sarah's actual call sign or an official designation. Private First Class Danny Martinez, fresh from supply school, spent his first 2 weeks believing that supply bot was a specialized military occupational specialty that he might eventually be trained for. "Is supply bot like a rank or a job description?" he asked Corporal Walsh during his orientation week. "It's what we call Captain Kane," Walsh explained. "She's really good with logistics data and procedures, so Gunny started calling her supply bot because she processes information like a computer." What Walsh didn't mention, because she hadn't noticed it herself, was that Sarah's computer-like processing actually extended far beyond logistics data. She absorbed and analyzed everything happening around her with the same systematic precision, noting personal conflicts among the staff, identifying operational inefficiencies that went beyond her official responsibilities, and maintaining detailed mental records of everyone's capabilities and limitations. The nickname reached its peak usage during a base-wide efficiency review conducted by a team of inspectors from Marine Corps headquarters. Bull took particular pleasure in demonstrating his division's capabilities by showcasing supply bot's ability to provide instant answers to complex logistical questions. "Supply bot," he called out during the inspection, his voice carrying the theatrical tone of someone demonstrating a particularly impressive piece of equipment. "Tell the colonel how long it would take to completely re-equip a 200-man unit for desert operations, including weapons, vehicles, and 3 weeks of supplies." Sarah looked up from the inventory report she had been reviewing. Assuming standard equipment loadouts and current inventory levels, initial deployment could begin within 18 hours. Complete equipment distribution would require 42 hours, with vehicle preparation adding an additional 12 hours for full operational readiness. The inspecting colonel raised an eyebrow. "That's remarkably precise, Captain. Do you have access to some kind of automated system that calculates these timelines?" "No, sir," Sarah replied simply. "It's based on standard procedures and current resource availability." Bull beamed with satisfaction. "Like I said, sir, supply bot's got all the data programmed in. Makes my job a lot easier when I need quick answers." The inspectors were impressed by the apparent efficiency of the supply division, noting in their report that the logistics coordinator demonstrated exceptional familiarity with operational requirements and resource management. They had no way of knowing that Sarah's instant calculations were based on years of experience planning actual combat deployments rather than computer-like data processing. By the end of her first year at Camp Pendleton, SupplyBot had become so firmly established as Sarah's identity that many personnel genuinely forgot her actual name. She had become a fixture in the logistics department, reliable but unremarkable, efficient but unthreatening. This suited Sarah perfectly. The nickname that Bull intended as mockery had become the perfect camouflage, allowing her to observe and understand everything happening on the base while remaining completely invisible as a potential threat to anyone's plans or activities, including Morrison's illegal operation, which had been running smoothly for months, partly because no one expected SupplyBot Kane to notice patterns in equipment requests that might indicate unauthorized transactions. Have you ever been given a nickname that was meant to put you in your place, only to discover it gave you exactly the freedom you needed? Sometimes the labels others use to diminish us become our most effective disguise. When the supply division closed each evening at 1800 hours, most personnel headed to the chow hall or their barracks, eager to decompress from another day of routine military duties. Sarah Kane, however, had developed a different pattern that would have seemed unremarkable to anyone who bothered to notice, which almost no one did. Every evening she would spend an additional 30 minutes in the warehouse, ostensibly conducting final inventory checks and securing equipment for the night. Bull had initially been impressed by her dedication to thoroughness, interpreting her extended hours as the behavior of an officer trying to compensate for limited field experience through excessive attention to detail. What Bull didn't realize was that Sarah's evening routine had nothing to do with inventory management. During those quiet 30 minutes when the warehouse was empty and the base was transitioning to evening duties, Sarah would move through the facility with an entirely different purpose. She had identified 17 distinct observation points within the supply warehouse that provided clear sightlines to various sections of the base perimeter, the motor pool, the enlisted barracks, and the administrative buildings. Each evening she would visit these positions in a carefully planned sequence, spending exactly 90 seconds at each location, cataloging patterns of movement, vehicle traffic, and personnel behavior. To anyone who might have observed her movements, Sarah appeared to be conducting routine security checks or equipment inspections, but her eyes were tracking details that had nothing to do with supply management. She noted which Marines consistently stayed late in buildings that should have been empty, which vehicles were moved during off-duty hours, and which personnel seemed to have access to areas outside their official responsibilities. The small leather-bound notebook she carried appeared to contain standard supply inventory data. In reality, it held detailed observations written in a shorthand notation system she had developed during special operations training. Vehicle license plates, personnel identification numbers, timing patterns, and behavioral anomalies, all recorded in a code that would appear meaningless to anyone without specific training in intelligence documentation. On Thursday evenings, Sarah's routine included a specific stop at the window overlooking the eastern maintenance yard. From this position, she had a clear view of the loading dock where equipment was transferred between the warehouse and transport vehicles. 3 weeks ago, she had begun noticing irregularities in the evening loading patterns. Standard protocol required that all equipment transfers occur during daylight hours under direct supervision. Yet twice each week, usually on Tuesday and Friday evenings, Sarah observed vehicle activity in the loading area during hours when no authorized operations should have been taking place. The vehicles involved were civilian trucks rather than military transport, and the personnel conducting the transfers were wearing civilian clothing over what appeared to be military gear. Most significantly, the timing of these operations coincided with gaps in the security patrol schedule, a detail that suggested someone with inside knowledge of base security procedures. Sarah's training had taught her to recognize the hallmarks of unauthorized operations: consistent timing patterns, non-standard equipment usage, personnel behavior that avoided official oversight, and most importantly, activities that occurred during predictable security vulnerabilities. But her observations went deeper than simply documenting suspicious activity. Using techniques learned during counterintelligence training, she had begun building detailed profiles of the personnel involved. Morrison's group consisted of 5 Marines whose official duties provided legitimate access to equipment storage areas, vehicle maintenance facilities, and base security protocols. Corporal Jake Morrison held a military occupational specialty in motor transport, giving him authorized access to military vehicles and knowledge of transportation schedules. Lance Corporal Tony Vasquez worked in communications, providing him with information about security patrol timing and radio frequencies. Corporal Brad Mitchell was assigned to the armory, with direct access to weapons and tactical equipment. Private First Class Danny Kruger worked in the base exchange, handling civilian vendor relationships and financial transactions. Staff Sergeant Ron Blake supervised weekend duty rosters, allowing him to influence which personnel would be on duty during specific time periods. Together they formed a nearly perfect network for conducting unauthorized equipment sales. Each member contributed specific access or knowledge that eliminated normal security barriers, while their legitimate duties provided cover for activities that might otherwise attract attention. Sarah had also identified their probable customers through careful observation of the civilian vehicles involved in the transfers. The trucks bore commercial license plates from 3 different states, suggesting a distribution network that extended well beyond the local area. Vehicle identification numbers, when she could observe them clearly, traced to companies that appeared to be legitimate security contractors or military surplus dealers. The sophistication of the operation indicated careful planning and significant financial motivation. This wasn't petty theft of individual items, but systematic diversion of military equipment worth thousands of dollars per transaction. More concerning to Sarah was the escalation pattern she had documented. Initially, the unauthorized transfers had involved relatively minor items: surplus uniforms, basic camping equipment, and outdated electronics. But recent observations suggested they had begun moving more valuable and potentially dangerous materials, including night vision equipment, tactical radios, and what appeared to be ammunition containers. Sarah's intelligence training had taught her to recognize when criminal operations begin expanding beyond their original scope. The progression from low-value theft to high-value equipment suggested that Morrison's group had become comfortable with their methods and confident in their ability to avoid detection. This confidence had led them to take greater risks, including the decision to intimidate potential witnesses rather than simply avoiding exposure. Sarah realized that Morrison's harassment of Riley represented a dangerous escalation that indicated the group viewed themselves as untouchable. During her evening observations, Sarah had also noted changes in Morrison's personal behavior that suggested increasing stress and paranoia. He had begun varying his routes between buildings, checking over his shoulder more frequently, and engaging in what appeared to be counter-surveillance activities, behaviors typical of criminals who suspect they might be under investigation. On the small table in her quarters, Sarah kept a collection of items that would have seemed perfectly normal to any casual observer: a base directory, training schedules, equipment manuals, and maintenance logs, the kind of reference materials that any logistics coordinator might need for routine duties. But these documents served a different purpose for Sarah. She had used them to create detailed maps of base operations that went far beyond official organizational charts. She knew which personnel had access to which facilities during which hours, who had legitimate reasons to be in specific locations during off-duty time, and most importantly, who was deviating from normal patterns in ways that suggested unauthorized activities. The equipment manual for the base's vehicle fleet had allowed her to identify which trucks were being used for unauthorized purposes by cross-referencing maintenance records with observation data. The training schedule helped her predict when large groups of Marines would be occupied with exercises, creating opportunities for unobserved equipment transfers. Hidden within the pages of these mundane documents were small pieces of paper containing encrypted notes about Morrison's operation. Written in the same shorthand notation she used for field intelligence reports, these notes documented names, dates, vehicle information, equipment types, and behavioral patterns that painted a comprehensive picture of ongoing criminal activity. Sarah had also established communication protocols that appeared routine but served intelligence-gathering purposes. Her weekly equipment reports to various departments included carefully worded questions about missing or damaged items that allowed her to track which materials were being diverted without directly investigating the thefts. When the base's monthly security briefing noted an unusual number of administrative losses in tactical equipment, Sarah cross-referenced this information with her observation data to confirm that the items had been taken during Morrison's unauthorized operations rather than legitimately lost during training exercises. 3 nights ago, Sarah had observed something that changed her assessment of the situation's urgency. Morrison's group had begun discussing their activities in outdoor locations rather than inside buildings, suggesting they suspected possible electronic surveillance. More importantly, their body language during these conversations indicated disagreement and stress within the group. Sarah's experience with criminal organizations had taught her that internal conflicts often led to desperate actions as group members began prioritizing self-preservation over operational security. When criminals become paranoid about exposure, they often make dangerous decisions to eliminate perceived threats. Riley's inadvertent discovery of their operation had transformed her from an unknown civilian into a specific threat that Morrison's group needed to address. Sarah realized that their escalating harassment was likely a precursor to more direct action if they became convinced that Riley posed a serious risk to their operation. Have you ever noticed something was wrong long before anyone else did, but couldn't act on your suspicions without revealing how much you really knew? Sometimes the most dangerous knowledge is the kind you can't share. Late on Sunday evening, Sarah sat alone in her small living room, carefully removing a metal lockbox from beneath a loose floorboard under her desk. The box had remained hidden for 3 years, containing items she had hoped never to need again after leaving her previous assignment. The weight of it in her hands brought back memories of operations she had worked hard to forget, missions that had defined her identity before she became Supply Bot Kane. Inside the lockbox, wrapped in black cloth, lay a collection of items that told the story of who Sarah Kane really was. At the top was a faded photograph showing a group of 12 Navy SEALs in full combat gear standing beside a helicopter in an undisclosed location. The photo was dated 7 years ago, and in the center of the group stood a younger version of Sarah wearing the insignia of a special operations training instructor. Below the photograph was a military identification card that most personnel would never have seen. Instead of the standard military ID format, this card bore the designation CT Instructor Level 5 and contained security clearances that went far beyond typical military classifications. CT stood for Survival, Evasion, Resistance, Escape, Counter-Terrorism, the most advanced survival and combat training program in the U.S. military. Sarah had spent 8 years as one of only 12 instructors authorized to teach CRCT protocols to Navy SEAL teams, Special Forces units, and select CIA operatives. Her specialty had been training elite personnel to survive and operate in hostile territory when conventional military support was impossible. The techniques she taught went far beyond standard military survival skills. They included advanced psychological warfare, improvised weapons construction, escape and evasion in urban environments, and most importantly, how to eliminate threats using minimal resources and maximum efficiency. The lockbox also contained a series of commendation letters that painted a picture of exceptional service in the most dangerous assignments the military could offer. Letters from commanding officers describing her ability to train personnel for missions that officially didn't exist. Recommendations from CIA liaisons who had worked with graduates of her training programs. Most significantly, a personal letter from Admiral Marcus Hammer Davidson, the commanding officer of Naval Special Warfare Command, thanking her for her role in preparing teams for operations that had prevented multiple terrorist attacks on American soil. But the most telling item in the collection was a black leather journal containing detailed notes from training sessions she had conducted with some of the most elite warriors in the American military. Page after page of tactical scenarios, psychological preparation techniques, and combat strategies that represented years of accumulated knowledge about how to survive and prevail in impossible situations. Her SEAL students had called her Ghost Wolf because of her ability to appear and disappear during training exercises, teaching them to use their environment as both weapon and shield. She could move through hostile territory without leaving traces, eliminate sentries without alerting nearby personnel, and most importantly, plan and execute operations that achieved maximum tactical advantage through careful preparation and perfect timing. The journal contained specific techniques that had become legendary within the special operations community, methods for conducting surveillance in urban environments, protocols for neutralizing multiple armed opponents, and strategies for psychological warfare that could demoralize enemies without direct confrontation. These weren't theoretical concepts. They were field-tested techniques that had saved the lives of American military personnel in conflicts around the world. Sarah's training philosophy had been built around a simple principle. The most dangerous warrior is the one who appears completely harmless until the moment action becomes necessary. She had taught her SEAL students to blend into any environment, to observe without being noticed, and to strike with devastating effectiveness when the time was right. Her specialty had been what she called gray zone operations, missions that occurred in the space between obvious military action and civilian life, training personnel to operate in environments where they couldn't rely on conventional military support, backup, or even official recognition. These operations required individuals who could maintain cover identities for months or years while gathering intelligence and preparing for actions that might never come. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The most classified section of her journal detailed techniques for long-term deep cover operations, how to establish and maintain false identities, how to build relationships that provided operational advantages, and how to remain psychologically prepared for immediate action despite months or years of apparent inactivity. This training had been reserved for the most elite Navy SEAL teams assigned to counterterrorism operations in hostile nations. Sarah had been recruited for CRCT instruction after distinguishing herself during 3 deployments, where she had demonstrated an unusual combination of tactical expertise and psychological stability under extreme pressure. Her ability to remain calm and effective during situations that would break most people had made her ideal for training others to survive similar challenges. But the assignment that ended her special operations career was also contained in the lockbox, a mission report from Operation Silent Guardian, classified at levels that meant it would never appear in any public records. The operation had involved a 3-month deep cover assignment in Eastern Europe, where Sarah had been tasked with identifying and eliminating a terrorist cell planning attacks on American military installations. The mission had been successful by all official measurements. The terrorist cell had been neutralized, the planned attacks had been prevented, and valuable intelligence had been gathered about international terrorist networks. But the psychological cost of spending 3 months living among people she would eventually have to kill had left Sarah questioning whether she wanted to continue in special operations. The final entry in her journal, written after returning from Operation Silent Guardian, reflected her internal conflict. Successfully completed mission parameters, cell eliminated, intelligence gathered, threat neutralized. But I keep thinking about the conversations, the shared meals, the trust they placed in their new friend before I killed them. Effective tactics, mission success, but at what personal cost? Need to consider whether this is sustainable long-term. 3 weeks after writing that entry, Sarah had requested transfer to a non-combat assignment. She had cited family considerations, her desire to provide stability for Riley after her ex-husband's death in a training accident, but the real reason was simpler. She had become one of the military's most effective killing machines, and she needed time to remember who she was beneath that expertise. The transfer to logistics coordination had been approved immediately. Commanders understood that elite special operations instructors often needed breaks from the psychological intensity of their assignments. Sarah's service record guaranteed that she could return to special operations training whenever she chose. But Sarah had used the transfer for a different purpose. Rather than taking a break from her skills, she had used the assignment to practice the ultimate test of her training, disappearing completely into a cover identity, while remaining fully prepared for immediate action if circumstances required it. For 3 years, she had successfully convinced everyone around her that she was exactly what she appeared to be, a competent but unremarkable logistics officer with no special capabilities. The success of this long-term cover operation had proven to herself that her training remained sharp even when it appeared dormant. Now, as she carefully examined each item in the lockbox, Sarah realized that Morrison's threat to Riley was about to end the longest and most successful undercover operation of her career. The skills she had hoped never to use again were about to become necessary, not for national security or military objectives, but for the most personal reason possible, protecting her daughter. At the bottom of the lockbox lay the item that represented the end of her cover and the beginning of something much more dangerous, a small black device that looked like an ordinary pager but actually contained encrypted communication protocols that could reach Admiral Davidson's office within minutes. Activating it would signal that Ghost Wolf was returning to operational status. Sarah held the device for a long moment, knowing that using it would change everything. Riley would learn the truth about her mother's background. Her quiet life as supply bot Kane would end permanently, and Morrison's group would discover that they had chosen to threaten the daughter of one of the most dangerous people the U.S. military had ever produced. Have you ever had to choose between protecting someone you love and preserving the life you'd built together? Sometimes the people we care most about never know how far we're willing to go to keep them safe. The crisis began at 13:47 hours on a Tuesday afternoon when Riley Kane walked out of the base library carrying an armload of returned books and nearly collided with Corporal Morrison and 4 of his associates positioned directly in her path. The collision wasn't accidental. Sarah could see from her office window that Morrison's group had been waiting specifically for Riley to exit the building, timing their approach to create an unavoidable confrontation. Well, Morrison said loudly enough for other personnel in the area to hear, his voice carrying the false friendliness that predators use to mask aggression. "If it isn't our favorite little bookworm, you've been avoiding us lately, college girl. That's not very neighborly." Riley attempted to step around the group, but Lance Corporal Vasquez moved to block her path while maintaining the appearance of casual conversation. From a distance, the interaction would look like Marines being friendly with a dependent, nothing that would attract official attention or intervention from passing personnel. Sarah watched through her office window as Morrison leaned closer to Riley, speaking in tones too quiet to be overheard by anyone not directly involved in the conversation. But Sarah could read body language with the precision of someone trained in surveillance and threat assessment. Morrison's posture was aggressive, territorial. Riley's response showed controlled fear masked by determined composure. "Listen carefully," Morrison said, his smile never wavering, even as his words carried unmistakable menace. "We've been patient with you, given you time to think about what you saw and what you're going to do about it. But patience has limits, and we've reached ours." Staff Sergeant Blake positioned himself to Riley's left, creating what tactical specialists call a box formation, a positioning strategy that makes escape difficult while maintaining plausible deniability about aggressive intent. To any casual observer, 5 Marines were simply having a friendly conversation with a young woman. "See, the thing about accidents," Morrison continued, "is that they happen when people aren't paying attention to their surroundings. Military bases can be dangerous places for civilians who don't understand how things work around here." Riley attempted again to leave, but Private First Class Kruger stepped into her path, dropping something deliberately and bending to pick it up, forcing her to stop. The maneuver was smoothly executed and appeared entirely innocent, but it trapped Riley in the center of their formation. "My mom expects me home soon," Riley said, her voice steady despite the obvious threat. "People will start looking if I don't show up." Morrison's laugh was genuinely amused. "Your mom? You mean supply bot? Trust me, sweetheart, your mom processes inventory data and fills out requisition forms. She's not exactly what I'd call intimidating backup." From her office window, Sarah could see that the situation was escalating beyond verbal intimidation. Morrison's group was becoming more aggressive in their positioning, and Riley was beginning to show signs of genuine distress. What concerned Sarah most was that they had chosen to confront Riley in broad daylight in a relatively public area, behavior that suggested either desperation or growing confidence in their ability to operate without consequences. The conversation continued for another 3 minutes, with Morrison's group taking turns making veiled threats while maintaining the appearance of friendly interaction. Sarah watched Riley's responses carefully, noting her daughter's attempt to remain calm while clearly understanding that she was in serious danger. Then Morrison made a critical mistake. Instead of allowing Riley to leave with a warning, he decided to escalate the confrontation into something more physically threatening. He reached out and grabbed Riley's arm, not aggressively enough to be obvious to distant observers, but firmly enough to prevent her from walking away. "Here's what's going to happen," Morrison said, his grip tightening on Riley's arm. "You're going to come with us for a little ride off base. We're going to have a more private conversation about your memory problems and what it's going to take to fix them permanently." That statement crossed every line that Sarah had been hoping Morrison would respect. Physical restraint, threat of kidnapping, and the implication of permanent harm. These actions transformed the situation from criminal intimidation into an immediate threat to her daughter's safety. Sarah had spent 3 years preparing for the possibility that her cover might need to end suddenly. She had mentally rehearsed dozens of scenarios where circumstances might force her to abandon her supply bot identity and take direct action. But she had always assumed such a situation would involve external threats to base security, not a direct attack on Riley by personnel she had been observing for weeks. As she watched Morrison's group begin moving Riley towards the parking area behind the commissary, Sarah realized that her long-term surveillance and intelligence gathering had come to an abrupt end. All the careful observation, all the documented evidence of Morrison's illegal operations, all the strategic planning for eventual official intervention, none of it mattered anymore. What mattered now was that 5 Marines who believed they were dealing with the defenseless daughter of a harmless logistics officer were about to discover that they had made a catastrophically dangerous miscalculation. Sarah opened her desk drawer and removed the encrypted communication device she had hoped never to use. But instead of activating it to request backup or official intervention, she turned it off completely. This situation was beyond the reach of official channels, too immediate for proper procedures, too personal for bureaucratic solutions. Morrison's group had made their choice when they decided to physically threaten Riley. Now Sarah would make hers. She locked her office door and moved to the window that provided the clearest view of the commissary parking area. Morrison was guiding Riley toward a civilian truck, the same vehicle Sarah had observed during their unauthorized equipment transfers. The rest of his group was positioning themselves to prevent interference while maintaining security around their operation. They were executing the kidnapping with the same tactical awareness they used for their equipment theft, treating Riley like a piece of valuable cargo that needed to be moved efficiently and without attracting attention. Their confidence in their ability to operate undetected had made them bold enough to conduct a daytime abduction on a military base. That confidence was about to become their greatest vulnerability. Sarah had spent months learning every detail of base security protocols, personnel schedules, and operational patterns. She knew exactly how long they had before security patrols would notice unusual activity in the commissary area. She knew which routes they would use to transport Riley off base. Most importantly, she knew their individual capabilities, psychological profiles, and tactical weaknesses. Morrison's group believed they were dealing with a logistics problem that could be solved through intimidation and control. They had no idea they were about to face someone whose job had been teaching Navy SEALs how to survive and prevail when outnumbered by better-armed enemies in hostile territory. As Morrison's truck began moving toward the base exit, with Riley inside, Sarah made the decision that would end her 3-year cover operation and transform her from supply bot Kane into someone much more dangerous. She had exactly 12 minutes before Morrison's vehicle reached the off-base location where they could operate without any possibility of official intervention. 12 minutes to intercept 5 armed Marines who believed they held all the tactical advantages. For someone with Sarah's training and experience, 12 minutes was more than enough time to remind Morrison's group why threatening the family of a special operations instructor was considered one of the most dangerous mistakes anyone could make. The hunt was about to begin, and the hunters had no idea they were about to become the prey. Have you ever watched a situation escalate to the point where you knew peaceful solutions were no longer possible? Sometimes the moment arrives when all the patience and restraint in the world can't protect the people you love. Sarah moved with purpose and precision that would have shocked anyone who had known her as Supply Bot Kane. Her first stop was the armory access panel behind her office, a security feature that most personnel didn't know existed. Using a maintenance key that she had legitimately obtained months earlier, she opened the panel and quickly disabled the electronic logging system that recorded all weapon access. This would give her a 30-minute window before the security malfunction triggered automatic alerts. She entered the armory with the confident movements of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. Her selection process was methodical and specific. She chose a Sig Sauer P226 pistol standard Navy SEAL sidearm that she could operate with her eyes closed, 2 extra magazines, a tactical knife with a 4-inch blade, and a set of flexible restraint ties that could be used for multiple purposes. But her most important selection wasn't a weapon at all. From the communications equipment section, she retrieved a handheld radio configured to monitor base security frequencies. This would allow her to track Morrison's movement while ensuring that her own actions didn't interfere with legitimate base operations. Sarah's 3 years of careful observation had provided her with detailed knowledge of every route between the base and the surrounding area. Morrison's group had 3 possible exit strategies: the main gate with its security checkpoint and documentation requirements, the maintenance gate used for civilian contractor access, or the emergency vehicle exit that bypassed most security protocols but required specific access codes. Based on their operational pattern and their need to move Riley quickly without official scrutiny, Sarah calculated a 78% probability that they would use the maintenance gate. This route provided the best combination of speed and security avoidance, but it also created a tactical vulnerability that Sarah could exploit. The maintenance gate was located in a section of the base perimeter that included a natural choke point, a narrow access road bordered by drainage ditches on both sides. Vehicles using this route had to slow down significantly to navigate the turn, and the terrain provided multiple concealment opportunities for someone with advanced tactical training. Sarah retrieved her personal vehicle, a civilian sedan that she had specifically chosen for its unremarkable appearance and reliable performance. But her real transportation would be something Morrison's group would never expect: her own feet and her ability to move through terrain that vehicles couldn't navigate. She drove to within 400 meters of the maintenance gate, then abandoned the vehicle and proceeded on foot through the drainage system that ran parallel to the access road. This route would allow her to reach the choke point before Morrison's truck, while remaining completely invisible to anyone traveling by vehicle. The drainage system consisted of concrete channels designed to handle storm runoff, with maintenance access points every 200 meters. Sarah moved through this network with the fluid efficiency of someone trained in urban warfare environments. She had memorized the layout during her evening observation routines, understanding that this knowledge might eventually prove tactically useful. As she moved into position, Sarah activated the radio and immediately heard Morrison's voice coordinating with base security at the maintenance gate. "Civilian contractor vehicle departing with authorized personnel for off-base training coordination," he reported, using official language that would discourage questions about his activities. The security guard's response confirmed that Morrison's truck was being processed through the gate without additional scrutiny. Sarah checked her watch. She had approximately 4 minutes before the vehicle reached her position. 4 minutes to prepare an intercept operation that would disable 5 armed Marines while ensuring Riley's safety. Sarah's tactical assessment of the situation was straightforward. Morrison's group possessed superior numbers and firepower, but they also had critical disadvantages that she could exploit. They believed they were transporting a helpless civilian rather than conducting a combat operation, so their tactical awareness would be focused on security rather than defense. Most importantly, they had no idea they were being pursued by someone with advanced combat training. Her primary objective was Riley's immediate safety, which meant she needed to disable Morrison's group quickly and decisively before they could use Riley as a human shield or bargaining chip. Her secondary objective was gathering evidence of their illegal activities, which would require keeping at least one of them alive and capable of providing testimony. Sarah positioned herself in the drainage culvert that provided the best angle of approach to the choke point. From this location, she could observe Morrison's truck as it slowed for the turn while remaining invisible to the occupants. The concrete structure would provide protection from small arms fire while giving her multiple escape routes if the situation escalated beyond her control. Through her radio, she heard Morrison's truck request permission to proceed to the off-base training facility, a location that Sarah knew from her intelligence gathering was actually an abandoned warehouse where Morrison's group conducted their equipment sales. The facility was isolated, surrounded by chain-link fencing, and far enough from civilian areas to ensure that any confrontation would remain private. Sarah realized that Morrison's choice of location actually worked to her advantage. The warehouse provided a controlled environment where she could engage his group without risking civilian casualties or official interference. It also meant that Morrison was following a predictable route that she could use for tactical planning. But first, she needed to gather real-time intelligence about the situation inside Morrison's truck. How many weapons were present? What was Riley's current condition? Were there additional personnel involved who hadn't been visible during the initial confrontation? As Morrison's truck approached the choke point, Sarah activated a technique she had taught to countless SEAL teams during training exercises. Using the radio frequency scanner function on her communications equipment, she intercepted the cell phone conversations taking place inside the vehicle. Morrison was speaking to someone at the warehouse, confirming their estimated arrival time and discussing preparations for processing their package. The clinical language he used to refer to Riley confirmed that Morrison's group was treating this as a professional operation rather than an impulsive kidnapping. More importantly, Sarah learned that Riley was conscious and apparently uninjured, but that Morrison's group was planning to use pharmaceutical sedatives to keep her manageable during their conversation. This information changed Sarah's tactical timeline. She needed to intervene before they reached the warehouse and began using drugs that could compromise Riley's health. Through the intercepted conversations, Sarah also confirmed that Morrison's group was carrying minimal weapons. Their confidence in their ability to control one civilian had made them careless about tactical preparations. This overconfidence would become their critical vulnerability when they discovered that their helpless civilian was actually the daughter of someone much more dangerous than they had ever encountered. As Morrison's truck completed the turn and began accelerating toward the warehouse, Sarah made her final tactical decisions. She would not attempt to stop the vehicle at the choke point. Too much risk of injury to Riley if the truck crashed or rolled over. Instead, she would follow them to the warehouse and engage Morrison's group after they had exited the vehicle, but before they could establish defensive positions inside the building. Sarah emerged from the drainage system and returned to her vehicle, but now her movements carried the focused intensity of someone transitioning from surveillance to direct action. Every aspect of her behavior had changed: her posture, her awareness level, and most importantly, her mindset. Supply Bot Kane had been a carefully constructed cover identity designed to hide Sarah's true capabilities. But that identity was about to disappear completely, replaced by the person she had been before her transfer to logistics coordination. Ghost Wolf was going hunting, and Morrison's group was about to learn why threatening a SEER instructor's family was considered one of the most dangerous mistakes anyone could make in the military community. Have you ever felt that moment when you stop trying to avoid a confrontation and start planning how to win it? Sometimes the most peaceful people are the ones who understand exactly how much violence they're capable of when someone they love is in danger. The abandoned warehouse sat 15 miles from Camp Pendleton, surrounded by 8-foot chain-link fencing topped with razor wire. Morrison had chosen the location carefully, isolated enough to avoid unwanted attention, but accessible enough for his equipment sales operations. What he hadn't considered was how the same isolation that protected his illegal activities would work against him when facing someone with Sarah's tactical expertise. Sarah parked her vehicle 800 meters from the warehouse, concealed behind a cluster of storage containers that provided both cover and multiple escape routes. From this position, she could observe Morrison's truck as it approached the facility while remaining invisible to anyone inside the perimeter. Through her binoculars, she watched Morrison's group execute what they clearly believed was a professional operation. Blake exited the truck first, scanning the perimeter for potential threats before signaling the others to proceed. Vasquez took position near the warehouse entrance while Mitchell and Kruger flanked the vehicle where Riley was being held. Their tactical positioning revealed both competence and critical weaknesses. They were executing standard security procedures for a controlled environment, but their formation was designed to prevent escape rather than defend against attack. More importantly, their attention was focused inward on maintaining control of Riley rather than outward on potential external threats. Morrison emerged from the truck and walked around to the passenger side where Riley was seated. Sarah could see through her scope that Riley appeared alert but frightened, her hands apparently secured with plastic restraints. Morrison spoke to her briefly before opening the door and motioning for her to exit the vehicle. What Morrison's group didn't realize was that their professional operation was being observed by someone who had spent years teaching elite military personnel how to assault defended positions against superior numbers. Every aspect of their positioning, their spacing, their sight lines, their escape routes, was being analyzed by someone who could identify tactical vulnerabilities that they didn't even know existed. Sarah's assessment was methodical and precise. 5 targets, 4 armed with standard military sidearms, positioned in a defensive formation designed for crowd control rather than combat. Their primary advantage was numbers and firepower. Their critical disadvantages were overconfidence, predictable positioning, and complete lack of awareness that they were being hunted. The warehouse itself provided multiple tactical opportunities. The building had 4 main entrances, 6 windows at ground level, and what appeared to be roof access through a maintenance ladder on the eastern wall. More importantly, the facility's electrical system was controlled by an external junction box that Sarah could access without entering the perimeter. Sarah's operational plan formed with the clarity that comes from years of tactical training. Phase 1 would involve disabling their external security and creating confusion. Phase 2 would focus on isolating individual targets to prevent coordinated resistance. Phase 3 would secure Riley's safety while maintaining control of the situation. But first, she needed to gather more detailed intelligence about the interior of the warehouse and confirm Riley's exact location within the facility. Sarah moved to within 200 meters of the perimeter fence, using drainage ditches and abandoned equipment for concealment. From this position, she could hear fragments of conversation between Morrison's group and observe their movements through the warehouse windows. Brought her here to have a more private conversation about memory problems. Morrison's voice carried clearly in the quiet desert air. Make sure she understands what happens to people who see things they shouldn't. Blake's response confirmed that they were planning to use intimidation and possibly violence to ensure Riley's silence about their illegal activities. Through the warehouse windows, Sarah could see that Morrison's group had established a command area near the center of the building, using stacked equipment boxes to create what they believed was a secure interrogation space. Riley was seated in a metal chair, still restrained, while Morrison and his associates positioned themselves around her. Their formation inside the warehouse revealed the same tactical weaknesses Sarah had observed outside. They were focused on controlling Riley rather than defending their position, and their positioning created blind spots that someone with advanced infiltration training could exploit. Sarah checked her equipment one final time. The pistol was loaded with one round chambered, safety off. The tactical knife was secured in an accessible position. The radio was set to monitor base security frequencies to ensure that her actions wouldn't interfere with legitimate military operations. Most importantly, she activated the encrypted communication device that would signal her return to operational status. But instead of requesting backup or official intervention, she programmed it to send a delayed message that would alert Admiral Davidson's office to the situation only if she failed to check in within 2 hours. This was a personal operation now, beyond the reach of official military procedures. Sarah approached the perimeter fence at a point where the razor wire had been damaged by weather, creating a gap just large enough for someone with her flexibility and training to navigate. She moved through the opening with movements so controlled and quiet that she seemed to flow like liquid shadow. Inside the perimeter, Sarah became something that Morrison's group had never encountered before, a special operations instructor operating in an environment where she held every tactical advantage. They thought they were conducting a criminal operation in a secure location. She knew she was hunting 5 targets in a controlled environment where her superior training and experience would determine the outcome. The first phase of her assault began with the electrical system. Sarah located the main junction box and systematically disabled the warehouse's lighting, creating an environment where her night vision training would provide a decisive advantage. The sudden darkness would create confusion and force Morrison's group to react rather than act, shifting tactical momentum in her favor. "What the hell?" Morrison's voice exploded from inside the warehouse as the lights went out. "Blake, check the electrical system. Vasquez, maintain position on the girl." Their response to the power failure revealed exactly what Sarah had expected. They assumed the darkness was caused by equipment malfunction rather than deliberate action. This miscalculation would cost them the tactical awareness they needed to defend against someone with her capabilities. Sarah moved toward the warehouse's eastern entrance, using shadows and industrial equipment for concealment. Through the radio, she could hear Morrison's group attempting to coordinate their response to the power failure, but their communications revealed confusion and growing concern rather than professional tactical discipline. "I can't see anything out here," Blake reported from his position near the electrical junction box. "Looks like the main breaker tripped, but I can't tell why." "Just fix it," Morrison responded, his voice carrying stress that indicated he was beginning to understand that their situation might be more complicated than a simple equipment failure. Sarah reached the eastern entrance and tested the door, unlocked as she had expected. Morrison's overconfidence in the warehouse's isolation had made him careless about basic security protocols. She entered the building with movements so careful that she made no sound audible above the conversation between Morrison's group. Inside the warehouse, emergency lighting provided minimal illumination, creating exactly the kind of low-light environment where Sarah's training provided maximum advantage. She could see Morrison's group clearly while remaining invisible in the shadows near the entrance. Riley was still seated in the metal chair near the center of the warehouse, surrounded by Morrison and his 4 associates. Their positioning formed a rough circle that provided them with overlapping fields of fire, but also created the tactical vulnerability that Sarah had been planning to exploit. They were so focused on maintaining control of Riley that they had created blind spots in their perimeter security. Morrison was speaking to Riley in tones that carried unmistakable menace. "Listen carefully, college girl. We're going to have a conversation about what you saw, what you're going to remember, and what's going to happen if you make the wrong choices about cooperation." Those words confirmed what Sarah had already known. Morrison's group represented an immediate threat to Riley's safety that could only be resolved through direct action. The time for surveillance and intelligence gathering had ended. The time for Ghost Wolf to remind these Marines why threatening a seer instructor's family was considered a fatal mistake had arrived. Have you ever been in a situation where you realized that all your training and experience had been preparing you for one specific moment? Sometimes everything you've learned in your life converges into a single opportunity to protect what matters most. The first Marine to fall never saw it coming. Blake, positioned near the electrical panel attempting to restore power, was focused entirely on the junction box when Sarah emerged from the shadows behind him. Her approach was completely silent, a technique she had perfected during dozens of training exercises with SEAL teams who prided themselves on their own stealth capabilities. Sarah's tactical knife found the exact pressure point between Blake's neck and shoulder, applying precisely calculated force that rendered him unconscious without causing permanent damage. He collapsed silently to the concrete floor, his radio and weapons secured before his body had fully settled. The entire engagement lasted less than 3 seconds and produced no sound audible to his associates inside the warehouse. From her new position near the electrical panel, Sarah had a clear view of the remaining 4 Marines positioned around Riley. Their formation had tightened in response to Blake's failure to report, but they were still operating under the assumption that they faced equipment problems rather than tactical opposition. "Blake, status report," Morrison called out, his voice carrying the first hints of genuine concern. When no response came, Vasquez moved toward the electrical area to investigate. "I'll check on him," he announced, drawing his sidearm as a precaution, but still moving with the casual confidence of someone who didn't expect to encounter serious resistance. Sarah allowed Vasquez to approach within 10 feet of Blake's unconscious form before initiating her second engagement. This time she emerged from concealment with her pistol drawn, the barrel pressed against Vasquez's temple before he could react to her presence. "Weapon on the ground, slowly," Sarah commanded, her voice carrying an authority that Vasquez had never heard from supply bot Kane. "Make any sudden movements and your friends will be cleaning your brains off the warehouse floor." Vasquez's eyes went wide with shock, not just at the surprise appearance of an armed opponent, but at the complete transformation in Sarah's demeanor and capabilities. This wasn't the quiet logistics officer who processed supply requisitions and avoided confrontation. This was someone who moved and spoke with the controlled lethality of elite military personnel. "Supply bot?" Vasquez whispered, his confusion evident even as he carefully placed his weapon on the concrete floor. "Wrong name," Sarah replied, securing his pistol while maintaining her tactical position. "Turn around, hands behind your back." As she secured Vasquez with plastic restraint ties, Sarah could hear Morrison and the remaining 2 Marines beginning to realize that their situation had changed dramatically. Their radio communications revealed growing alarm and the beginning of tactical preparations for defending their position. "Vasquez, report immediately." Morrison's voice carried increasing urgency. "Blake, what's your status?" When neither Marine responded, Morrison's tone shifted to something much more dangerous. "Mitchell, Kruger, we've got a problem. Take defensive positions around the girl. Someone's moving against us." Sarah smiled grimly as she heard Morrison begin issuing tactical orders. His training was kicking in, but his understanding of the situation remained fatally flawed. He was preparing to defend against conventional assault by unknown enemies, not realizing that he was facing someone who had taught the techniques he was trying to use. From her position near the electrical area, Sarah could observe Morrison's remaining group as they established what they believed was a defensive perimeter around Riley. Mitchell took position behind a stack of equipment boxes, that provided cover from the main entrance. Kruger moved to the opposite side of the warehouse, creating crossing fields of fire that would make direct assault extremely dangerous. Morrison himself remained close to Riley, his pistol drawn and ready. His positioning made Sarah's tactical challenge clear. Any direct assault would put Riley in immediate danger from a man who was becoming increasingly desperate and unpredictable. But Sarah's training had prepared her for exactly this type of scenario. During SEER instruction, she had taught countless exercises focused on hostage rescue in confined spaces against multiple armed opponents. The key was psychological warfare, creating enough confusion and fear among the hostage takers to disrupt their tactical coordination. Sarah activated her radio and tuned it to the frequency that Morrison's group was using for internal communications. What they heard next would shake their confidence and force them to make critical tactical errors. "Morrison," Sarah's voice came through their radios with crystal clarity. "This is Captain Sarah Kane, SEER Instructor, Naval Special Warfare Command. You're surrounded, outgunned, and operating against someone who trained the people you think you are." The silence that followed lasted nearly 10 seconds. Sarah could hear Morrison's harsh breathing through the radio as he processed the implications of her words. "That's impossible," Morrison finally responded, but his voice carried uncertainty that hadn't been there minutes earlier. "You're supply bot. You process inventory and fill out paperwork." "Wrong again," Sarah replied, her tone carrying the kind of controlled menace that she had used during psychological warfare training. "I'm the person who taught Navy SEALs how to eliminate multiple armed opponents in confined spaces. I'm the instructor who specialized in turning overconfident criminals into cautionary tales." Sarah paused, allowing her words to sink in. "2 of your men are already down. Blake is unconscious near the electrical panel. Vasquez is secured and disarmed. That leaves you, Mitchell and Kruger, facing someone who has been planning this operation since the moment you decided to threaten my daughter." The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Sarah could see Mitchell's position shift as he began scanning for threats he couldn't identify. Kruger's radio discipline broke down as he began asking Morrison for instructions about enemies he couldn't locate. "How do you want this to end, Morrison?" Sarah continued, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who had conducted similar operations against much more dangerous opponents. "You can release Riley and surrender, or you can discover why special operations instructors are considered some of the most dangerous people the military produces." Morrison's response revealed exactly what Sarah had expected: desperation mixed with dangerous overconfidence. "I've got the girl, Kane. Whatever you think you are, whatever training you think you have, I'm the one holding the cards here." "No," Sarah replied calmly. "You're the one holding a losing hand against someone who's been watching your illegal operation for 3 months and planning for this exact moment." Through her scope, Sarah could see Morrison's face change as her words registered. The revelation that his equipment sales had been under surveillance shattered his confidence in the security of his operation and his understanding of his tactical situation. "That's right, Morrison. I know about the stolen equipment, the civilian buyers, the unauthorized sales. I have documentation of every transaction, every participant, and every violation of military law you've committed. The question now is whether you want to add kidnapping and assault on a federal investigation to your charges." Sarah's words weren't entirely accurate. She hadn't been conducting an official investigation, and she had no federal authority in this situation. But Morrison's group didn't know that, and their growing panic was exactly what she needed to maintain tactical advantage. Mitchell's position broke first. The combination of invisible enemies, superior firepower, and the revelation that their operation had been compromised proved too much for his psychological stability. He abandoned his defensive position and began moving toward the main entrance, apparently attempting to escape rather than continue fighting. Sarah was ready for him. As Mitchell reached the doorway, she emerged from shadows he never knew existed and disabled him with the same efficient precision she had used on Blake and Vasquez. 3 down, 2 remaining, and the tactical situation now heavily in her favor. Morrison's voice came through the radio with the desperate edge of someone who was beginning to understand just how completely outmaneuvered he had become. "Kane, whatever you want, we can negotiate. No one has to get hurt here." "You're absolutely right," Sarah replied, her tone carrying satisfaction that Morrison's group was finally beginning to understand their situation. "No one else has to get hurt. All you have to do is release Riley and surrender." Have you ever watched someone realize that they've made a mistake so massive that there's no way to undo it? Sometimes the most dangerous moment in any confrontation is when the other side finally understands how much trouble they're really in. The final confrontation began when Morrison made his last desperate gamble. With 3 of his men down and his tactical situation deteriorating rapidly, he grabbed Riley roughly by the shoulder and pressed his pistol against her temple. "That's far enough, Kane. I don't care what kind of special forces ninja you think you are. One wrong move and your daughter's story ends right here." From her concealed position, Sarah could see the fear in Riley's eyes, but also something else, a controlled composure that reminded Sarah of herself. Riley wasn't panicking or pleading. She was waiting, watching, and preparing to act when the opportunity arose. 3 years of living with a mother who taught survival instincts without revealing why had left their mark. Kruger, the last remaining member of Morrison's team, had positioned himself behind a concrete pillar with a clear view of the main warehouse entrance. His hands were shaking as he gripped his weapon, the psychological warfare having taken its toll on someone who had signed up for easy money, not combat against elite military personnel. "Here's what's going to happen," Morrison continued, his voice carrying the brittle edge of someone operating beyond their capabilities. "Kruger and I are walking out of here with the girl. You're going to let us reach our vehicle, and then maybe we'll discuss releasing her once we're somewhere safe." Sarah's response came with the calm certainty of someone who had faced similar situations countless times before. "Morrison, you're making the same mistake you've been making all along. You still don't understand who you're dealing with." Through her radio, Sarah's voice carried an authority that seemed to fill the entire warehouse. "Let me explain your situation in terms you can understand. You're holding my daughter at gunpoint in an isolated location where no one can hear what happens next. That's not a tactical advantage. That's a death warrant." Morrison's grip on Riley tightened, but Sarah could see the uncertainty in his posture. "You won't risk your daughter's life. No matter what kind of training you have, you're still a mother." "You're absolutely right," Sarah replied, and for a moment Morrison's confidence seemed to return. "I am a mother, which means I'll do things to protect my daughter that would horrify the enemies I faced in combat operations." Sarah's tone shifted to something that made even Kruger stop breathing for a moment. "I've killed people in 6 different countries, Morrison. I've eliminated terrorist cells, neutralized enemy operatives, and taught America's most elite warriors how to survive when they're outnumbered and outgunned. But none of that was personal. The psychological pressure was precisely calculated. Sarah had learned during SEER instruction that the most effective way to break an opponent's will was to make them understand that they faced someone who operated by completely different rules than they understood. "This is personal, Morrison. You threatened my family. You put your hands on my daughter. You made this about something more important than military objectives or national security. You made it about a mother protecting her child." Morrison's breathing was becoming audible through the radio, his stress levels rising to dangerous points. Sarah knew that desperate people made unpredictable decisions, but she also knew that psychological pressure applied correctly could force opponents to make tactical errors. Kruger, Sarah's voice shifted to address Morrison's last remaining support. You joined this operation for easy money. You didn't sign up to face a special operations instructor who's been planning your destruction for months. Walk away now and you'll live to spend whatever money Morrison already paid you. The offer was strategically brilliant. Sarah was using the classic military tactic of dividing enemy forces by offering individual survival options that undermined group cohesion. She could hear Kruger's position shifting as he considered her words. "Don't listen to her," Morrison shouted, but his voice carried desperation rather than authority. "She's bluffing. She can't get to both of us while we're holding her daughter." Sarah's response demonstrated exactly why Morrison's assessment was wrong. "Kruger, look at your position carefully. You're behind concrete cover with a good view of the main entrance. Very tactical, but check the shadows to your left, the area you can't see because of the pillar placement." Kruger's head turned instinctively toward the shadows Sarah had mentioned, and his sharp intake of breath was audible through the radio. Sarah had somehow positioned herself within striking distance while he was focused on Morrison's hostage situation. "That's right," Sarah's voice came from directly behind him, no longer transmitted through the radio, but spoken with quiet lethality just inches from his ear. "I've been in position to eliminate you for the past 3 minutes. The only reason you're still breathing is because I wanted to give you the chance to make better choices." Kruger's weapon fell from nerveless fingers as he realized that the special operations instructor had moved through the warehouse like a ghost, positioning herself to strike while he was focused on the wrong threats. His surrender was immediate and complete. "Morrison," Sarah called out, now holding Kruger's weapon in addition to her own. "You're alone now. No backup, no support, and facing someone who specializes in exactly this type of situation." But Morrison's response revealed that desperation had pushed him beyond rational decision-making. "I'll kill her, Kane. I swear I'll put a bullet in her brain before you can stop me." Sarah's voice, when it came, carried a tone that Riley had never heard before, the voice of someone who had moved beyond negotiation into operational mode. "Morrison, you just made your final mistake." What happened next occurred with the precision and speed that separated elite special operations personnel from conventional military training. Sarah had spent years teaching techniques for neutralizing armed hostage takers, and Morrison's positioning had given her exactly the tactical opportunity she needed. The engagement lasted less than 2 seconds. Sarah's movement was so fast and precise that Morrison never had the opportunity to carry out his threat. By the time his brain processed that Sarah was in motion, his weapon was already being redirected away from Riley, and his ability to resist was being systematically eliminated through techniques that few people in the world could execute successfully. When the dust settled, Morrison was on the concrete floor, unconscious but alive, his weapon secured and his threat permanently neutralized. Riley stood in the center of the warehouse, free from restraints and uninjured, staring at her mother with a mixture of shock, admiration, and dawning understanding. "Mom?" Riley's voice carried the weight of someone whose entire understanding of reality had just been fundamentally altered. "Who are you really?" Sarah looked at her daughter, this young woman who had shown such courage and composure under impossible pressure, and realized that 3 years of carefully constructed cover identity had just ended forever. There would be no more supply bot Kane, no more quiet logistics officer, and no more hiding from the truth about who she really was. "I'm someone who loves you enough to become very dangerous when anyone threatens you," Sarah replied. but her tone was gentle now, the operational coldness replaced by maternal warmth. And apparently, I'm someone who needs to have a very long conversation with you about family history. As sirens began approaching in the distance, Admiral Davidson's people responding to the encrypted signal Sarah had programmed, Riley stepped forward and hugged her mother with the fierce intensity of someone who had just discovered that the person she thought she knew was actually far more remarkable than she had ever imagined. "I always knew there was something different about you, Mom," Riley whispered. "I just never knew it was something this incredible." Sarah held her daughter close, feeling the weight of 3 years of deception lifting from her shoulders. Supply bot Kane was gone forever, but Sarah Kane, mother, protector, and apparently still very much the ghost wolf, was exactly where she belonged. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give the people we love isn't protecting them from who we really are, but trusting them enough to let them see the truth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.